Hello and welcome to Mindscapes, our series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy define our contemporary world. My guest today is one of India's most distinguished scientists, but a scientist whose work has not merely been in the seclusion of a laboratory, but in the public domain, shaping, implementing policy, scientific policy for the government of India. He's been a scientific advisor to the Prime Minister, a secretary in the Department of Science and Technology, a member of the Planning Commission, and at the Indian National Science Congress early in the year, he was one of the 2 scientists awarded with the Millennium Award. I'm delighted to welcome Professor M.G.K. Menon.
Thank you.
You've had this long association with formulating, shaping policy in the government with regard to science and technology. You've been interested in education and a whole range of areas associated with science. Let's go back a little, and India's first Prime Minister, Nehru, was deeply concerned that India should develop a scientific temper. Yes. 50 plus years, how close, how much progress do you think we have made towards that aspiration?
Not very much, if you really ask me. You see, the whole point is this, that Panditji had a really good intuitive feeling for science and what science represented. And it was not for him purely a matter of the final products of science or the technologies that developed, the applications that developed, and therefore then the artifacts which you see around. And one of the real problems today is that we tend to confuse science and the scientific method, scientific thinking, our whole sense of curiosity, the sense of excitement, with the end products which are far more visible, which is, of course, I mean, a telephone or a television set, which is an aeroplane or a missile, and so on and so forth. So we see the end products, and we begin to really say that all of that is science. None of them would have come about today without science. That's certainly true.
So what are the elements of the scientific temper?
It essentially means that people first are willing to question. And the most important aspect of it is, you know, there are 3 very useful words to consider here. Why, how, who. And yet in this country today, the who is the most important. Whereas what should be really important is why. And that's the old nursery rhyme. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. I mean, it's a sense of curiosity, trying to understand what is it, why does it take place that way, how does it take place that way, not who said it. Whereas in our country the problem is, by and large, it is who. The caste system is who.
To what degree do you think that this is in tune with or contrary to our civilizational impulses? Or is it something that has been lost, that has been diluted?
Well, it's, you know, the whole point is this, it's a question of what one means by civilizational impulse. India has, of course, had a very hoary tradition, in a sense, and we've had many scientific discoveries in a certain sense. And when I think back of even one particular area which is totally separate from what happens elsewhere in the world, Ayurveda. We know, of course, we always talk about the zero, we talk about the numerals, We talk of the discoveries in mathematics, in astronomy, and so on and so forth. And India has done great things, and one can recount all that history. But if you take Ayurveda, it really represented an attempt to understand in a completely different way a holism. It attempted to talk about synergy, relationships, and in a certain sense how you keep the body healthy rather than treat disease. Now, if you take that tradition, it was not purely a matter of following rituals or following what somebody said. In fact, if you ask yourself, what is our civilizational background? Was Gautama the Buddha a part of it? Would you say so? If so, then please see what he has written. That is, believe from your experience rather than what the elders say, what someone else has said, and don't therefore go just by that. Whereas the tendency today is say, हाँ मैंने अखबार में पढ़ा है, मैंने टेलीविजन के ऊपर देखा है, therefore it must be true, therefore I act upon it.
But don't you think that the impersonality, the impersonalness in a sense of technology, and technology is a carrier of information perhaps, but in what ways do you see the distinction then between education and information? We have looked at education in a far more holistic way. We have prided ourselves in the guru, shishya, parampara, the interaction between the master and the pupil. Isn't there a risk that somehow education through this impersonal means is going to take away that system, that aspect of humanness, of values?
No, I don't think so. I think the fact is, I'm not arguing for somebody being educated totally all through life. You take a baby and put in a dark room and you just have access to IT, and that everything, all the inputs are through IT, you know, other than the material inputs of food and so on. You can't have virtual food. I mean, the body requires food for metabolism. But you could do all the other things well. I don't mean that. There has to be an interaction with the teacher. But on the other hand, a large part of the load of the teacher, which at the present moment relates to bringing to the knowledge or notice of the student facts and techniques and methods and so on, go away, and give the teacher much more time to impart precisely what you're talking about. It does not mean there is no Guru Shishya Parampara. On the other hand, what I'm really arguing for is that the teacher is then free to impart what is really important, to bring out what is best in the student. For example, let me tell you, in the old days when I was a student in Jodhpur, an out-of-the-way place, and I had wonderful teachers. Why do I regard them as wonderful? They were not Nobel Prize winning scientists. They were not great poets and people who will win the Jnanpith Award or anything else. They were very simple people. But you went to their homes. They were happy to see you. You sat with them and you worked with them. When it was meal time, you had meals with them. That is what I call Guru Shishya Parampara.
I think we've been sort of pointing to this aspect of ethics and values that we might associate with science, so that the management of science in some ways demands of us. And perhaps we can sort of enter this realm of discussion by, you know, the most recent engaging in the United States on the issues of cloning human beings, whether you can work with stem cells, you can't do that, To what degree do you feel it is actually possible to steer, manage, suggest, impose an ethical framework to scientific research? Or does it really in the long run have a logic, an imperative, a force, a direction of its own?
Well, the first point is, of course, the latter is true. It has a certain momentum of its own which carries forward. That is certainly true. You cannot go back. However, the fact remains that ethics is a very, very important element in science, because science means trying to understand nature. It is a search. It's not the end point, it's a search. It's a continuing process of search. And in the search, many things will come up, convenient and inconvenient. That's how you understand nature. Now, there must be integrity in that search. That is why, for instance, hoaxes don't succeed. And the most important quality for a scientist is really scientific integrity. Ethics is part of that. The second part relates, of course, to the ethics that you are talking about. Now, you mentioned about cloning and questions of this nature. The question you can ask is, do you stop something being done? Or do you consider its application? For example, elsewhere in the world, in the United States today, or in Britain, somebody who works with ultrasound uses it commonly in the case of pregnancy, and that is done for the benefit of the mother and the to-be-born child. Okay. So you're determining sizes, you're determining position, everything. Sex is an automatic feature. And determining sex there is not regarded as unethical. It is not illegal. Parents ask, and the doctor will say, yes, you're going to have, tell the mother, you're going to have a girl, you're going to have a boy. It's not regarded as wrong. But what's happening in Delhi today? I saw in today's paper somebody, a doctor, being hauled up under the law that we have because of sex determination. Why? Because in our society we have a system whereby the male child is important, the female child is a burden, the female child has to be destroyed, therefore sex determination is leading to female infanticide or feticide. And essentially feticide, because infanticide takes after they are born and later. Now, because of the special cultural situation here, the problem of ethics arises here, which wouldn't be the case there.
I can see what you're saying in the larger philosophical framework.
Yeah.
But would you intervene and say, no, we're not going to do research on cloning, or we're not going to do research on X, because this has, in society as it exists today, potentially dangerous implications, and so we're going to stop it for now?
Well, there are, for example, it is not a question of stopping it, doing it under controls. That is, you cannot do it just on the side, by yourself, because then you are taking a decision. It has to be taken by within an ethical framework. And that is what is done. For example, the biologists got together at a famous meeting called Asilomar. And at that meeting, they said that, look, there are fears relating to all these things, relating to genetic engineering and all the things that were coming ahead. So how do we deal with it? And how do we ensure containment? What are the procedures which will be followed, etc., etc. So what will really happen is that there will be a control by the scientific community exerted in a way which is regulatory in some sense, if you wish to call it that way, not total freedom to do what you like, but within a framework.
You have been a votary and an eloquent spokesperson, in a sense, of the rights of to scientific information and knowledge amongst the developing countries for their own processes of learning and evolution. To what degree do you think that the information technology, the shrinking of the world, the easy access to information, has in fact both benefited and, in a sense, perhaps adversely impacted developing countries? And I should just qualify the way I say adverse. It really means that we're not always able to assimilate and access constructively, purposefully, the information that is in marketplace of scientific knowledge, as it were.
First of all, as a scientist, I do believe that the very basis of science has been openness and transparency. Now, I understand the limitations. I'm now coming to the area which relate to patents and intellectual property rights and so on and so forth, and I'll deal with it in a moment. But broadly, I am all for openness. And a very large part of what we today benefit from is open and has been open. And there are very great examples of that. And for example, the discovery of antibiotics came from penicillin, Alexander Fleming. That was not patented except later in production. Similarly, for example, one of the great pieces of work in biology was essentially the hybridomas, and Milstein refused to patent it. So I can talk of many, and after all the great discoveries of science, which there was nothing patented which led finally to the original atomic bomb. I mean, all the work took place. Of course, the actual work relating to the bomb aspects were secret. That's during the wartime. But in a certain sense, science has been open. What is now happening, of course, is that a large part of science, and science is getting expensive, very large teams are at work, and to finally get something through costs money. Therefore, somebody has to invest in it. And if you invest in it, you have to get a return for it. And therefore, there is this whole aspect of a property right, as a result of which you can get a return. I can see the point. Now, the situations have changed with time. For example, if you ask yourself, what about aspirin? Who ever tested aspirin? We're all using aspirin all the time. We now know some of the side effects of aspirin in terms of gastric bleeding and so on and so forth. But it's one of the age-old and trusted elements in any drugstore. But you introduce a new drug today, and you have to go through so many different trials and tests. These are not free. They all cost money. Therefore, somebody has to pay for it. I'm just giving you an illustration of it. On the other hand, one has also taken a general principle that this money cannot come from those who really badly need it, the disadvantaged. It cannot come from those who are ill. It cannot come from the poor, in a certain sense. And that is why life-saving drugs, which are used in life-threatening situations, to spread major epidemic and pandemics
We've seen
and
the
so
AIDS
on,
example.
AIDS, and therefore I fully agree with what India has done, in particular CIPLA, with regard to the provision of the AIDS drugs in South Africa, for example. Now, so I think we have to look at it in a much broader sense. But the more important issue that you have raised is about the capability to absorb and utilize. If everything was available, would you still be able to use it? The answer is no. You have to build your own scientific capabilities to be able to absorb. Not only that, the application has to be specific. For example, one of the great achievements in India, which I admire tremendously, is the fact that we can feed ourselves today. The public distribution system is a different matter. Godowns which are bursting with food and not yet being made available to the really needy and poor and starving, that's a separate issue. That's a management issue. But the fact that we do grow food in such a large quantity is a very significant achievement. Now, it is not that we did the great discoveries of science relating to it here, but we had the scientific base and capability of plant breeders, those who dealt with diseases, to be able to bring in what was the best from outside, marry it, the so-called hybridization, adapt it to our fields and all the cultural practices of agriculture, and finally make it work. Therefore, there is a very important question of making the management system effective to work it out. So it's not just a matter of access to knowledge. You let loose, for instance, an individual in the National Library into the library of a great university, what would you pick up? What would you do? You can have Greek books, Latin books, Russian books, Chinese books, and what would you do with them? Or a whole range of books in mathematics or science, what would you do with them? You must have the ability to absorb. The final point is that there are differences in what applications are called for. And that relates to the stage of development of education. And that is why we need applications directed, for example, in India, to the poor. Employment. The Prime Minister talked about a huge project relating to employment. I think that is going to be the most serious problem this country is going to face as we move into the future. We've had the baby boom of the 70s and 80s. They're all coming into the employment market today. You can't use them in agriculture as you used to use them. And then what would you do to them? You can't employ them also at the very high investments that characterize modern industry. Therefore, you have to find a Gandhian solution. So therefore, our abilities to do this, use the vast resource of science, make use of that which is relevant to us, have the ability to absorb and transform it into final results. This is the secret or the heart of the management.
You're also heading amongst the many things that you do, a task force on information technology. Is this sustainable? Is this a bubble that will burst, like many of our bubbles seem ultimately to burst? What is the real value of this for us beyond all the software engineers that we seem to send out to the United States and Germany and other parts of the world?
Well, two things. One is that task force was set up for a specific purpose. We had a task to do. That's the task force. We did it. We submitted report 1 in 4 weeks on a totally transparent basis. There's been no report of the government of India done in that fashion, with openness. Every minute of our meetings, the minutes of those meetings, were on a website. You could get hits on it. You could say, I disagree with you. This must be done this way and not this way, and so on. That task force is over. Today there's the Ministry of Information Technology. So that is meant to deal with this area. Second point is, yes, there are aspects of information technology where people were trying to make rich in certain areas like the so-called dot-coms and so on, sudden areas of growth. That bubble has burst. But the real solid areas of IT, you cannot go back. You cannot go back on any of these areas. You can only go forward. Information technology is there to stay. And if I may say so, I get the feeling when I look at information technology of being in an avalanche. Because information technology is not the property of anybody. It's not the property of a country, or of one firm, or under one IPR patent. It's all of us.
But how sustainable is this? It has to coexist in a larger infrastructure of erratic, unstable power supply, which creates electrical surges which damage equipment, poor communication line systems, telephone lines which carry information technology to the community. So at the one hand, we have this very sort of utopian, elegant, sophisticated technology, and we read about computers in villages, but computers need dust-free environments. It's to be located in a very complex environment. To what degree do you think we're going to be able to marry these two?
That is the whole question. I mean, this is what the ministry will have to deal with in terms of hardware, in terms of software, in terms of applications, and you will not have the miracles of information technology everywhere. But I can certainly say that even if there were power failures and so on, there are times when the power does work. I mean, after all, I know that Delhi has very erratic power supply, but you still use geysers, and you do get hot water in winter.
But they require different kinds of electricity in terms
That's right. No, but what I'm really driving at is that we have to engineer many of these things in that sense. There are further expenses involved in uninterrupted power supplies and so on, battery-operated systems. I can see, for example, reducing the cost of computers even. I mean, I don't see that you need all these silicon computers. You may have paper, finally, chips. Things will move because science is something which really tries, through its understanding of nature, to do things better and better and better and faster and faster. That's why Moore's law, which applies in this particular area, where costs have halved and capabilities have doubled every 15 to 18 months in computer hardware and software. Now, who would have imagined when Rutherford sitting in a small dark room looking at alpha particles hitting a nucleus and bouncing back, and therefore discovering the nucleus, would lead to the atomic bomb? to lead to all these debates and discussions taking place on nuclear strategy, to nuclear reactors? Nobody would have predicted that. Or when Faraday, you know the famous saying about Faraday, when people from the government came and had a look at it, and one of the ladies asked, Mr. Faraday, of what use is all this likely to be, when you're showing her the whole question of what was electromagnetism then. He said, Madam, when we do find a use, the Treasury will know how to tax it.
You've spoken about better and faster. You're a philosopher, scientist, administrator. 1984 is behind us. Do you fear a 1984 kind of future with sort of a science that still seems essentially motivated by the commercial imperative rather than the philosophical questioning of why that you pointed to that is so desirable?
You know, science is something which you cannot essentially hold back. I mean, it's going to go ahead so long as people have curiosity and think. But let me make the following point. We are sitting here in a television studio and you're making a program. Look at what it has done. Would the world have known about what happened between the two, you know, all the Rwanda, Urundi clashes and so on which took place, the Hutus and Tutsis and so on, or what happened in the whole of old Yugoslavia, or what has happened in any part of the world? It comes to you instantaneously. Maybe a disaster, it may be an earthquake, maybe a flood, maybe reaching out aid to the people concerned. Without science, without the technologies developed with it, information is flowing real time, instantaneously. People are being sensitized, people are being brought together. So I think we have to capitalize on those features. And that is what I really mean by our value systems. I mean, we talk of many of these things about humanity being one, about the goddess Saraswati whom we should worship. But for me, the worship of goddess Saraswati is in the search for knowledge and the integrity that must underpin that search. Similarly, when we talk about humanity being one, it is to remove all the divisiveness that we see in society every day. To me, when I look at the human genome, it's an enormous scientific achievement. But when you see that the distinction between the human being in the human genome and what you see in a mouse or a monkey genome is not all that great, then we marvel at what created the human being.
Professor Menon, thank you very much. This has been a great privilege. Thank you.